All right, so this is our meeting on February 2nd, and we're going to work through some more of our workbook examples today. Specifically, we're going to start with problem 7. So this problem went out to deal with the hospital, has a large number of registered physicians, and each physician has IDs and specialties, and we're dealing with their relationship with patients. So there's a lot going on here. I'm going to go ahead and start some breakout rooms for everyone, and then give you guys a couple minutes to discuss, and we'll get back together and we'll talk about it a little bit. So bear with me here, and we'll get the breakout room started. All right, let's go ahead and talk about this one. Let's see, Diego Castaneda, you're up.
Yes, sir.
So whoever in your group did the diagram can share their screen, and then Diego, talk us through it.
Okay, perfect. So we had number 7. Hospital has a large number of registered physicians. Each physician has an ID and a specialty. And so we have the entity with physicians that has a specialty and a physician ID, and we underline physician ID as the primary key. And so then we said patients are admitted to the hospital by physicians, and patient information includes ID and name. And any patient who is admitted must have exactly one admitting physician. So that's where we put physicians admits patients, and we have a physician has to have only one patient can have admits by one physician and only one, and then they can admit either no patients or many patients. And then also on the entity of patients, we have the patient ID and the name, and we underline patient ID as the primary key. And then once admitted, a given patient must be treated by at least one physician, and a particular physician may treat any number of patients or may not treat any. And whenever a patient is treated by a physician, the hospital wishes to record the details of the treatment, such as date, time, and results. And so that's where we created the associative entity of treatment. And so physicians, coming off of physicians, we have off of physicians and patients, we have one and only one, because like we was mentioned last week in the table, you have to have one-to-one physicians and patients in the treatment table. But towards treatment, we have patients have to have at least one or can have many physicians, and physicians don't have to treat any patients, but they can also treat many. And off of treatment table, we have the date, time, and results, and we underline date as the primary key. This is where we were a little confused, but we underlined that one because we were saying that a patient can come in for the same treatment, but on different days. And so that's why we underline date on that one.
Sounds pretty reasonable to me. So again, when you look at the description, it says a physician can optionally admit a number of patients. Once they're admitted, they can be treated by at least one physician. They can treat any other patients or not treat any. And when they're treated, they want to know the details of the treatment, such as date, time, and results. So normally what would be unique inside the treatment table would be the combination of a physician and a patient. But in this case, a physician could treat a patient maybe even multiple times a day. So there could be some sort of time date stamp in there in addition, where your physician treats you and does a variety of different things. As long as there is at least one combination of physician and patient in that table, you're probably in pretty good shape, right? So that seems to make sense to me. Did any groups have anything significantly different that they would want to contribute to this discussion?
I had a question for you, Ted.
Yeah.
I like our group thought about it the same way, but I also, I guess when I was going back looking at this a second time, I was thinking to myself that potentially the treatment could be like a weak entity in the sense of you're not an entity, but I guess just weak in the sense that if you're not admitted, you can't be treated. So I was wondering how to think about that, or if that's a wrong way to think about it, I guess, or.
It's a good observation. If you think about all associative entities, they all are predicated upon the existence of the other sides of the equation, right? You can't have an associative entity if you don't have a situation where you're trying to basically model a many-to-many relationship between two existing strong entities. And the only reason why the associative entity exists is to allow that modeling to occur. So in terms of can an associative entity exist outside of the other entities? No, not really. So it has that same feature as a weak entity. We don't call it that. It gets its own category, associative entity, which is, it is a verb, it's a relationship, and we're modeling that relationship as a table because we're trying to model that distinct many-to-many situation that's happening in the data.
Gotcha.
So yes, it can't exist by itself, but it's not a weak entity, it's an associative entity.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Anybody else or any other groups want to contribute?
Sorry, would you include both the associative entity of treatment and the admits? I wasn't sure how you were defining the treatment, so we were talking about whether or not you could just have that treatment associative entity be the.
So, will the person who's sharing share their screen again real quick? Dismissed it too quickly. Great. So you'll note they actually have two relationships between physicians and patients. You have to have the treatment relationship, which is an associative entity because that's actually many to many. Each patient could have many treatments, each physician could provide many treatments, and there's a relationship between the patient receiving a particular treatment from a particular physician, maybe multiple times in a day or across multiple days. But the other relationship, the one that's on top, is that physicians admit patients, and they could admit no patients or lots of patients, but each patient has a single physician that is admitting them, and only a single physician that's admitting them. That one doesn't have an associative entity. That's a one-to-many relationship. We're going one direction, the physician could have lots and lots of patients, but might not have any. And going the other direction, the patient has one and only one admitting physician. So we're only drawing the picture, but if we were actually thinking about how we were modeling this data, what we would expect over in the patient's table is all kinds of information that's unique to the patient. Patient ID, last name, first name, address, phone number, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we would have a column that says admitting physician, and it would have a code for a physician ID. And it's unique to that patient. That's who admitted them. That's who put them into the hospital, right? And so that would have a single entry, and we'd be able to go look up all that information about that physician and figure out it's Dr. Smith and that's their specialty is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it would actually be physician ID, but we would call it a new column, which is the admitting physician, and would have a single entry. What we would also have is a separate table of treatments, which would be patient 1 has been treated by Dr. 437, and then they've been treated by Dr. 494, then they've been treated by Dr. 932, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, for all the various treatments that they've received while they're in the hospital. Does that help with your question, John?
That helps. Thank you.
Okay, of course. Anybody else?
Could you explain again how we decided that date was the, what is it called, foreign key off of treatment?
It is, they're including in this diagram that it's part of the primary key. And that's interesting.
I'm sorry, primary key.
It's clear that that's necessarily the case. If you go back and you look at the problem description, what they're saying is, particular physician can treat any number of patients. They may not treat any. When they're treated, the hospital wishes to record the details, such as the date, the time, and the results. So what they are reading into this, and I think this is reasonable, but it is not spelled out in the description, is, well, wait a minute. Is it possible that a doctor goes in at 8 a.m. and administers blood pressure medication, and then they also go in at 2 p.m. and they do the same thing? And I don't want to record those as two separate treatments, even though it's the same physician. It's just they're happening at different times of the day or a different day. And so they're adding an additional opportunity, which is that a physician can provide the same treatment at different times of the day or different days in that treatment table. If you don't do that, if you don't expand out the combination of physicians and patients to also include dates, what this treatment table would enforce is that a physician can treat a patient, but that relationship is basically a singular relationship. And once a physician treats a patient, they can never treat them again. And that's probably not realistic, right? You see Dr. Smith and he says, hey, you don't have a concussion. You never can see Dr. Smith again. They've given you their one and only treatment. And that's probably not the way this works. So by adding the date, it says, or even probably, I'm going to suggest it's a date timestamp. Okay, that's every time that they come in and visit you, there has to be a physician that provides the treatment, but it's happening at a particular time, and then we know something about it.
So would it be wrong to do date and time in one?
Yeah, I'd call, they're underlining date, but we all know that date could also include 1:43 p.m. And it probably is what is being included in that date is a time date stamp, basically.
Okay, so it wouldn't be wrong if I wanted to turn it into only 2 attributes and call one of them date and time and
That'd be
underline
great.
it.
That'd be fun.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? This one looks pretty solid. Nice job, guys. I appreciate it. All right, let's take a look at the next problem, which is problem 8. This one is a little bit tricky because there may be potentially some extraneous information and some challenging information from a time standpoint, where Steve is operating a cinema chain and wants to figure out what's going on in a particular cinema at any given moment in time. So again, I'm going to stick you in some breakout rooms. I'm going to give you a little bit of extra time on this one, see what you guys can suss out. Draw it as best as you possibly can. And if you are making any assumptions, you might want to kind of just type them off to the side saying, we're assuming something about whatever it might be, just so we can kind of read into the assumptions, because there might be something we have to make about how this problem is described. Okay, so I'm going to open up the breakout rooms again and give you guys some time to work on this. Let's talk about this problem. I'm going to ask for Haley Matzenbacher to give us her initial description of this problem. So if your group could share the diagram, that'd be great.
Okay. Let's see. Is it showing for y'all?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I have 2 screens and sometimes it's weird. Okay, I screenshot one of my other teammates because his looked a lot better than mine, but looked pretty similar. So we had the cinema is the top part, and then we kind of had some things coming off of there that we broke down in terms of the cinema ID to identify that, the name, the city, and the zip code, because there were multiple of them. And so we said has, and then mini theaters, and for each, there's multiple theaters, but in one cinema, so that was that relationship. And then for the theater, we had a theater ID and then the seating capacity. And then this was the one thing I didn't get on there, but moving in the direction of movies, we had the associative entity of shows. And so we said that this was a mandatory mini coming from this direction and an optional mini coming from the opposite direction, because the theater has to have multiple showings, but they don't have to have like the same movie showing. Well, they said it's not possible. So then breaking down from the shows, we had all of these different aspects. And then we also said that the primary key here, we kind of made like a date time slot. I don't think that was on mine after I took this. But as for the movie, we had the movie ID, the title, and the length. And the assumption that we made here was that movies shifting from theater to theater assumes a many-to-many relationship.
Okay. We're going to come back and talk about this one, but let's get another group to chime in and contribute what they're thinking as well. So Nathan Howard, will you have your diagram or share your diagram and see what looks the same, what looks different?
Sure. John, do you mind throwing it up?
Yes, if I can find the share link. There we go. Got it.
So ours looked fairly similar. Are we good?
Yeah, sorry. Is it showing? It's not showing up like the green.
It shows right on my screen. Everybody else look okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, John. So we showed that cinema can have at least one, but mandatory 1 theaters, but each theater is going to be attached to a cinema similarly. And for the cinema, we figured that it'll only have 1 address, or it'll at least have 1 main address, and use that as the key. Theaters, we had showings as the associative entities, where a showing will be attached to 1 theater and 1 movie only. And that a theater will have at least 1 showing, otherwise probably wouldn't be a theater at that point, and a showing, movies can be shown at different showings. But we decided to use the date timestamp for the showings for the key, and thought that maybe a showing ID would be extraneous information, I think is what we decided. But we, yeah, from here, this was kind of our line of thinking, similar to the other group with showings as the associative entity between theater and movies, with address, theater number, date timestamp, and then a movie title for the key identifiers.
So for the most part, both of these diagrams look pretty similar. So I'll just go ahead and talk about this one since it's up on the screen. One thing that I would point out is I do not think that this is a good idea. You might think that an address is something that's unique to the cinema, and therefore it's a good choice. But addresses change. I mean, it's possible that the street changes, or you actually move the cinema from one location in a strip mall to another location. That stuff changes. I would come up with a unique ID. There's no reason not to come up with some sort of cinema ID and use that for cinema. So if you were tempted to ever say, you know, somebody's phone number is unique to them. No, it isn't. Use something that is truly, truly unique and never changes. And even things like social security number. People do get new social security numbers. So for our own personal database at Texas A&M, you get a UIN, and your UIN is yours forever and ever and ever and ever. And it is something we made up, so we know that it can stay static to you forever. Same thing with course numbers, that sort of thing. A lot of times it's going to be something we manufacture as opposed to something that's in the real world. Even if you think that it's static, it may not be, and it's probably not a good choice for a primary key. Not a big deal, just something worth thinking about. The other thing I might think about, and we're not quite here yet in terms of modeling, but something we could consider, is that it is entirely possible that this whole thing right here, I might suggest to the person who's asking us to model this database to simplify this a little bit and just come up with unique identifiers for theaters, to the theater ID, that has the address where it's located, but we've got 19 theaters in College Station, and they all have a unique identifier that's different than the 12 theaters that we have in Caldwell, which is different than the 27 theaters that we have in Houston. Because really, we want to know something that is specific about each theater. That's really what we care about. And sure, they're all located in the same cinema. Who cares? That doesn't actually affect any of the decision-making process all that much. So the way you guys, both groups modeled it, and I'm guessing most other groups modeled it as well, is fine. But I think I'd push back a little bit on Steve and say, I want a unique theater ID, because otherwise what you're potentially getting here is you're getting theater number 1 in 73 different places all across the country. I'd rather see, hey, theater number 727, and I know exactly where that is, man. That's in Idaho, and that's our bestseller, right? Because it's a unique identifier for that theater across the entire company. So unique identifier for theater as opposed to a theater number that's unique to each cinema might actually play a little bit better. Just a thought on my part, but that's from me doing modeling from a long time. And it's not the way the problem is described. So I'm kind of getting out of the problem description a little bit and thinking ahead. The challenging part of this problem by far is how we tackle this thing, right? There's something odd going on here. And what I might actually suggest is that they might actually have a separate table in addition to all this stuff, which is that date time stamp that would be predetermined. It would be every day of the calendar year from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. is a time slot. And every day of the calendar year from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. is another time slot. And from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. is another time slot. We might almost predetermine what our various time slots are. Sounds like they're doing 2-hour time slots. It's not clear in the description if there are even some that are staggered, right? So some movies start 1, some movies start at 2, and there's a 2 to 4 time slot. I can't tell from the problem description if that's true or not. But maybe I predetermine what the various time slots are, and then I use that predetermined set of time slots as part of my unique identifier for showing. So you guys are trying to do that. Every group is. But how you do that, so you're making that time date stamp fit in that very rigid 2-hour block, that's hard. That's kind of hard to model. And that's one of the reasons why I like this question, is it points out that some of what we're trying to do with this diagram modeling, the diagram does tell a very clear picture. but other things aren't as clear. There's nothing about this picture that suggests to you that it has to be a 2-hour time slot that starts at 11 or 1 or 3 or 5 or 7. You can't read that in the diagram. We know it from the problem description, but it's not actually mandated in this structure. That's where I'm saying maybe if I already had a table that had time blocks and I define what that is, it illustrates a little bit more. I don't know. It's kind of hard to model that for sure, right? So this is kind of the challenge of this problem. Comments, feedback, questions?
So
this one makes some sense?
Do you agree or disagree with showings being an associative entity? Because
showings has to be an associative entity.
Okay, I got a little bit caught up personally on it says we never show a movie in more than one theater at a time.
Right, so what we're suggesting is some sort of rigid structure that would be for a specific time slot, for a specific theater, we can show a particular movie. And then, how do we then enforce, well, for that same theater, same time slot, we show a different movie? We couldn't do that, right? Because it'd be part of the unique identifier. If it was same theater, different time slot, well, then we could show a different movie or the same movie, that's fine. So by adding the time slot into this associative entity for the theater and the movies, it still allows for a unique combination of those three things. At any given moment in time, only one movie can show up in a particular theater. But what it doesn't enforce, and I think this is what Allison's getting to, is can a particular movie show up in a different theater at the same time slot that belongs to the same cinema? That's hard to enforce. And again, there's nothing in this diagram or the other diagram that necessarily enforces that rule. So this one's a tough one. This is one where maybe there's something additional outside of the diagrammatic structure that we would need to enforce inside the database, some sort of additional rule that says if a particular movie is being shown in our cinema at a given moment in time, it can't show up in any other theaters in that cinema at that exact same moment in time. I don't know that you can model that very easily. Now, alternatively, if you remove the date timestamp, if you actually get rid of this from the showings table, then you are enforcing that rule where each movie can only show up in each theater once. But then the problem is, well, they can only show up once. And we know that's not true because throughout the day, those movies can show up more than one time. So again, there is something about this diagram where there's some rules that we can't easily enforce using the diagram itself.
Yeah, I had one more quick clarification. I know we talked about this. It came up in the previous question too. So when we're thinking about a unique ID for an associative entity, we only need to delineate from like the relationship between the theater and the movie. So like essentially if we're showing this movie, you know, a bunch of different times, a bunch of different days, well, it can be only like, when was it shown in this theater?
Right.
So that might be, are we using theater and movie to narrow down and then need a unique identifier from there? Or does every showing need to have a unique ID?
This one's a really hard one to model. I don't know.
Okay.
Because he's got this particular rule of, well, we never show the same movie in more than one theater at any given moment in time. That combination of all those things is pretty tough. Yeah, enforcing that would be challenging. So you could do some sort of relationship just between theaters and movies, where a particular movie can only show in a particular theater, but then it doesn't allow for you to show multiple time slots. You can do a particular relationship between theaters and time slots and movies, but then you can't enforce the rule of, well, if there's a different time slot for a different theater, the same movie can show up. I don't know if there's an easy way of modeling that using the kinds of diagram tools that we have. This one's hard. Yeah. So you guys did kind of the best you can using ERDs, but ERDs do not capture everything about the real world. They do a pretty good job, but they don't capture everything, which is one of the reasons why this problem is part of the workbook, is it only captures most of what this person is describing, not all of it. Now, again, what we might say to this particular person is, why do you only show one movie in one theater at a particular time slot? Why not show it in 3 theaters if there's demand for it? Who cares? And you guys know that a lot of multiplex theaters do that, right? You get to multiple theaters that are showing the exact same movie. Now, some of them might be in 3D and some of them might be in crazy rumble seats and some of them might be spraying water in your face. I don't know. But there are a lot of these theaters that show the same movie in lots of different venues at the exact same time. So the fact that he's trying to enforce that rule, you might push back and say that rule doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't know. He has it. I don't know exactly how to model it using ERD. Could a database have a rule that says, we're not going to allow you to put the same movie in the same theater at the exact, or in 2 different theaters at the exact same time? Yeah, absolutely. We could do that in the actual software, but the diagram doesn't capture it very clearly. Other questions or comments? Good stuff so far. Anybody else? All right, let's break out into one more session for the next problem. This one is not nearly as complicated. Number 9, where we'll talk about sales are us, where they're writing invoices. So I'm only going to give you guys a couple minutes to kind of confirm amongst yourselves what your diagram looks like, and then we'll get back together and talk about it, okay? So aiming for like a 2:30, coming back together. All right, let's talk about this last problem. And Javier Lopez, you are up. So I'll ask one of your group mates to share your diagram, and then you can go ahead and talk to us about it. At the moment, you're
Sorry, I was muted. Well, quickly, where is it? There it is. Okay, so we didn't really finish just yet, but it's really simple. Just connect that there. So essentially what we said was that each sales rep could, you have to have a invoice for a sales rep. So we said that a sales rep had to have a mandatory connection to an invoice, but that an invoice, but they could have many invoices. So we put the mandatory up here, 1, and over here we had the mandatory 1, but you can have many into invoices. That invoice then had to have a customer. We said that the customer could go up into the invoice, but we sort of made the assumption where you can make an account with the sales rep. So they don't have to order, so they don't have to have an invoice just yet. And then from invoice, we connected that to products, and based off of what was happening on the detail lines. And from there, we stated that a product could have a vendor, but one vendor could have multiple products, and we each put a unique identifier of IDs. Oh, that should be also underlined. And then, yeah.
Okay. So I've got a couple questions about this one, and I'll have the peanut gallery share with me on what we think. So the first one I'm a little concerned about is this. Why am I concerned about that? Anyone?
A product can be on multiple invoices.
Yeah, what this suggests is that a product can be sold one time.
Okay.
And so this is a clear case for what? Someone else?
Associative entity.
Associative entity. So we'd pull that off to the side, and we basically, for an invoice, would have effectively line items. It's kind of what you commonly see in orders or invoices, is an additional associative entity, which is a line item, which is allowing that many-to-many of the product ID with the invoice ID, and then the quantity of that item and what you're being charged for that item and all that good stuff. Okay? So that'd be the first thing, is I'd be concerned about that relationship between the invoice and the products, and we'll let him go ahead and work on that part. There's another part that I think is a little ambiguous as far as the problem description. It says different products are supplied by different vendors. So what does this suggest? How would you read that out loud?
A vendor can have multiple products.
But each product can only be provided by one unique vendor.
Yes.
I don't know that's what the problem description says. What the problem says is different products are supplied by different vendors. But I don't know if it suggests that it's necessarily a unique vendor for each product. So I'm not saying that your diagram in this case, where I have it circled, is wrong. What your diagram says is that each product is only provided by exactly one vendor. It has to have a vendor, and it can only have one vendor. And that might absolutely be realistic. But it also might be the case that each product has to have at least one vendor, but it might have multiple vendors, multiple sources. The problem isn't clear. And if that were the case, you'd again have to have some sort of associative entity for provided by, and it would allow for multiple vendors to provide an item. So again, I'm thinking Amazon, right? When I go buy something from Amazon, there's 6 different people that are providing it with different prices and different availability and whether it's free shipping or not. And so they have some sort of associative entity there where each product could be provided by one or more vendors and still be sold through their interface. I don't know if that is the case in this problem or not, but if it was, we could add an associative entity and allow for it. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. And this is, again, I'd want to go back and ask sales or us, hey, is it a unique supplier of your stuff? And they would tell me yes or no. And in a lot of companies, it is. In a lot of companies, you get a particular product from one vendor and one vendor only. So the way you guys have modeled it is probably the realistic answer, but I just don't, it's not the only way you could model it. If another group read this slightly differently, that would certainly be reasonable. Okay. Last thing is I'm seeing this diagram, and you don't need to fix it obviously today, but moving forward, just typing ID for your unique identifier, you might as well leave the oval out.
Okay.
If you're going to put the oval in, it should be sales rep ID or invoice ID or customer ID or product ID. It needs to have a unique word because they're not all just ID. There's something that's specific to that table. But if that's all that it is, do we as a group today in this classroom and moving forward need to see that oval? Anyone here not clear that every one of these tables is going to have a unique identifier? And if nothing else is stated, it is probably the name of the table, ID, as a default, right? Student gets student ID, product gets product ID, customer gets customer ID, line item gets line item ID. Now, I would argue that line item doesn't get line item ID. Line item is different. Line item is an associative entity. What's unique about it? The combination of the invoice and a particular product. And that particular product can only show up in that invoice one time. Could you order 73 of that thing? Yeah. So you might add an additional attribute for that associative entity, which is quantity. It's not unique, but it's something that would be relevant to the line item, which is how much of a particular item they're ordering. I might add that because that attribute is additional information. This is where we're going to store how much of something you're going to be buying in a particular invoice. Okay. So there are things to think about. If it is obvious, things like ID, at this point, you want to leave the oval out, I'm fine with that. But if it's something that's additional, it's new information that is informative to the user, like quantity that's being ordered in a line item, I'd be good with you guys adding that back in. Does that make sense to everybody in terms of kind of what we can assume and what we can't assume for these diagrams? Is there anything wrong with you guys drawing all of the ovals? Absolutely not. But when I give you 7 minutes to diagram something and you need to cut something out, that might be one of them. I don't need to see that. We all know what's going on there. Okay. So we can make some assumptions at this point. We're getting a little bit more comfortable with how these diagrams work. So I think we could let that one go if we want to.
So just to clarify, for the line item, for the primary key, would you just put line item ID? I know you said that since it's a mixture of the two, you need something.
I would not put line item ID.
Okay,
I would
so what
allow
would
the unique combination of invoice ID and product ID by the two combined be what is unique for each row in that table. So for order number 12, you can order product 73, 74, 75, and 76. You can't order product 73 twice. You can order 2 of them, but it would be one line item, which would be for that invoice. There's this product, and I'm ordering 2 of them. It only shows up one time in that order. If you're seeing multiple rows of the same item being ordered in an order, you should just bring that down to one row, which is, well, I ordered 3 of them, or 5 of them, or 12 of them, or 27 of them. So the line item, if you're really going to look at that in terms of what it looked like in a spreadsheet table or a database table, it would be invoice ID, item ID, how much I ordered. Invoice ID, different item ID, how much I ordered. Invoice ID, yet a third item ID, how much I ordered, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just like any invoice you've ever seen in your entire lives. You go and you look at your orders when you go place an order online. That's what it is, right? It's what you ordered and how much you ordered, what you ordered and how much you ordered, what you ordered and how much you ordered. And they all fit under the umbrella of a single order that you're placing with a company.
And to be clear, to follow up on that,
Yeah.
you wouldn't be calculating that, you wouldn't show that field either, right? Because that's as good as like a concatenate in Excel, or you like that's something you can find, right, by combining the two, like invoice number and product number.
I wouldn't draw the little attributes off of line item.
Right.
I don't think you need that.
Right. Okay.
But I would assume that they're going to be there because that's how associative entities work.
Right. Gotcha.
I would, and obviously we're seeing this happening right now, is I would add quantity to the line item because that is something that is not obvious that it's part of the line item. And I'd want to tell the user, hey, we're going to record how much the user ordered of a particular combination of product in an order in this table. I think that's great.
So,
other questions or comments?
Other question. I had invoices written down as just an entity. Is that incorrect? It is supposed to be an associative entity, or could you say it differently?
I think that an invoice is an associative entity because what it is it's the relationship between a sales rep and a customer, potentially. I think that's reasonable. I think we're okay with that. That's the combination of when a sales rep sells something to you, they create an invoice, and they can have lots of invoices with a customer, and a customer can have lots of invoices with the sales rep.
Okay, because we had it, I guess we had it written slightly different where we had sales rep and then written and then invoices as an entity and then written and then customer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I could see where you'd want to treat invoice as its own separate entity, but it can't exist. An invoice cannot exist in this particular structure without a sales rep and a customer. Well, if it requires both of those to create that thing in the middle, that's an associative entity basically, right? In order for it to exist, the sales rep has to have a relationship with the customer. So it is effectively modeling that relationship. And that relationship could be happening over and over and over again. So you generate a new invoice every single time. So what would probably be in here as well, notice in this particular case, they do include an invoice ID. So even though sales rep and customer are kind of created this associative entity, I still need a unique invoice ID because can a sales rep have lots and lots of invoices with customers? Yeah, of course. So we have to allow for even more than one occurrence of that happening. Good questions, everybody. Any other questions or comments? Is it starting to make a little bit more sense? As we're working through the examples in class and working through them in the groups, people starting to click a little bit? It seems like it to me. I'm ducking into the groups every once in a while. It seems like you guys are making some sense of it. If you find that you are in your groups and you are a wallflower, your mini assignment between now and Thursday is to commit to being the most vocal person in your group for the Thursday assignment. So work through the problem you're going to work through, and then you're the one that's going to say, okay, I'm dominating this conversation. I'm going to tell everybody what's up, okay? Because it's important that you're not sitting back and watching everybody do this. I mean, that's the easy way out, but then when we get to an exam, you're not going to know what to do. So rather than wait until a situation where it's actually going to cost you a grade, commit to stepping up and being a loud voice in Thursday's group meetings, and then hopefully, if something goes wrong, no big deal, but if something goes right, you'll have a little bit more confidence moving into the next couple of assignments. Okay, so same drill. We're going to do this one more time. I feel like this is actually working pretty well. So we're going to try to tackle at least 10, 11, and 12, but I would like you to actually work through 13 and 14, because we might get ahead a little bit. It would certainly be worth your time to look through those. I don't know if we'll make it all the way through. Actually, sorry, even up to 15, because that gets us to then our relational schema. So between now and Thursday, I'm asking you to do a lot. Look through and get at least comfortable with those problems. If you can fully diagram them yourself, that's great. If you at least have some idea what's going on in those problems, that would be a good plan. And we'll try to talk through at least 3 of them, but maybe we'll even squeeze in 4 in class on Thursday to just kind of get more exposure to these problems. The more the better. Okay? All right. Thanks everyone for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Good job with the contributions. I'll be cold calling a couple more people on Thursday, so expect that. And I'll see you guys then. I'm going to stick around, but I'm going to stop the recording.